I think that that is extremely important for people to understand, that the Bible is a collection of writings that was not sacred when they were written. These texts were written by human beings for particular purposes that they had in mind, and they reflect very much patriarchy of antiquity.
Welcome to Religion Unmuted, where we explore what religion sounds like with women's voices turned up. I'm your host, Rachel Schneider, religion scholar and director of the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University. Today, we're going to be taking a historical look at patriarchy within Christianity. We're joined by April DeConick, a professor of New Testament and early Christianity at Rice University and author of Holy Misogyny: Why the Sex and Gender Conflicts in the Early Church Still Matter. Her research focuses on the silenced voices of religious people and communities that were left behind or discarded when Christianity emerged in the first 4 centuries as a new religion. Thank you for joining us, April.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So I want to talk today specifically about your book, Holy Misogyny, which really explores how women were systematically erased from the Christian tradition as it was forming. Can you elaborate more on the motivations behind your study and the directions that even led you to begin this scholarly research and write this book?
Sure. There was a moment in which I decided to actually write this book. And this book is now about 10 years old. So my son at the time was about 5 when he came to me after he had been in school. And it was clear that he was discussing with his friends or the teacher Christian concepts of God and heaven. One of the students, unfortunately, had a tragedy in which the mother had passed. And so they were trying to deal with the mourning and the grief within the classroom. And when he came home, he approached me and said to me, "I don't understand. Where is God's wife? If God doesn't have a wife, then how does he have babies?" And I just kind of put it back on him and asked him, well, what did he think about it? And he said, "I know, God's wife must have died." And that was really a moment where I thought, okay, this is the sort of stuff that we talk about in the classroom with students about what happened to the kind of female aspect of God, if you will. And she was systematically, as you said, erased from tradition. And so, where did she go and why did she go? So I wrote the book for him to answer his questions.
Yeah, and I found it fascinating in the book where you talk about how there were these early kinds of conceptions of God as feminine or the feminine aspects of God in ancient Judaic traditions. So can you just tell us a little bit more about what that was or how it transformed?
Yeah. So it's pretty clear now from archaeological evidence as well as looking at biblical text that there was a time in the history of ancient Israel where they worshipped a god named Yahweh and his consort. Probably Asherah was her name. And at some point in their history, just before they're exiled, they begin to understand this practice of taking ritual cakes, for instance, to the Queen of Heaven down in the temple as something they shouldn't be doing. They were being told at least that. And so after the Babylonians conquer them and take their priests and leaders into exile, the priests begin to think about why they were conquered. And they didn't come up with the answer we might think of today. Well, Babylon had a better army. Instead, they thought there must have been something that we've done wrong as a people to incur God's wrath. And the suggestion was made that they had not been good monotheists. So the Queen of Heaven was vanquished from her throne. But these female traditions still sort of hung around. And so we see them in text, and she becomes wisdom, God's wisdom. And you still see sort of matrimonial language around this figure within Jewish sources. And she kind of, she percolates there. Wow. The Holy Spirit, this idea of the Spirit of God, was always also perceived as a feminine word. It was literally a feminine word, but also was a feminine character, a kind of quasi-angel. You could kind of think of her as that.
One of the things that I thought was most interesting about your book is the way that you show how these remnants get incorporated into tradition and then reinterpreted and reimagined, but you still have this thread of the feminine if you're looking.
Yes. Yeah, if you have the keen eye and you go back and say, hey, wait a minute, why does God have breasts? Why does the Father milking? She's there, she's present, but it takes a lot of work to kind of pull out all of these passages and arrange them in such a way that you can really see what's going on.
Yeah. And that's why I'm really grateful for your work as
a
historian and as a biblical scholar. And in other parts of your book, you really present this historical evidence that women had these really wide-ranging leadership roles in the early stages of Christianity that sometimes ran counter even to dominant social convention. But you also argued that their leadership was often justified by theologies that actively devalued the female body in certain kinds of ways and upheld masculine supremacy. So can you tell our listeners more about the role of women in the first centuries of Christianity and the opportunities or challenges that they faced?
Yeah, that's a really big question.
Yes.
It's multi-layered. I'm trying to think of where to start. I'll just start with Paul's letters just to say that if you go in there and look at all the passages you don't normally look at, like at the end of letters where there's a lot of greetings going on and so forth, in those sorts of places, you find a lot of women's names who are being greeted as co-workers, as deacons, a variety of roles, as presiders of communities, patrons of communities, and so forth. So in our earliest information that we have about Christianity, which would be Paul's letters, we see this wide range of roles that they're playing. We also get a very curious passage in Galatians, which seems to be something they said at baptism, that in Christ there is neither male nor female. And some of the Christian communities were interpreting that quite literally in a social context, that men and women got to do the same things, which is unusual in antiquity. I mean, it's not unheard of, but it's unusual because of how the female body was perceived. That was the thing that surprised me the most in my research, because I had gone in thinking, as many of my colleagues, that we could explain the erosion of kind of women's leadership as sort of being a political thing or, a social thing. But actually what I discovered is that it was all about the female body and how it was perceived and understood in the ancient world as being a subordinate male or an inferior male. There's often language about, lacking the male body parts. And because the woman's body doesn't have that, she's not quite a male. And so she's also the property. Her body's the property of the male. And the male, she's there quite literally to sow seed, to have kids, to be heirs to the man's property. So she never has autonomy over her body. And so that is what is, I think, pressing down on any way that these women could really experience equality in antiquity. I talk about really that being an oxymoron.
Yeah. And that brings up questions about how the female body has been viewed, how it's been attempted to be transformed throughout, the history of Christianity. And it gets into really contemporary issues as well, this question of the autonomy of the body, or how women's bodies are understood and viewed in relation to men's bodies. So I want to ask about that. I want to go there. Within the United States, we've had a lot of conversations recently in the, news about religion, about sex, gender, the body. And how do you see the conflicts about sex, gender, and the body in early Christianity informing these current debates within Christian communities and society as a whole. Do you see connections or threads?
Well, yeah, there's two things going on. One is tradition. So these ideas basically have become so foundational and normal for us that we don't think about them and we don't think to critique them. Okay. So they're just our baseline. The second thing is the Bible. Like, as long as that text is around and is being read in communities that are reading it in a non-generous way when it comes to women and women's bodies, we're going to continue to have this conflict carried on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. What do you think are some issues or facts about sex and gender in ancient Judaism, Christianity, related traditions, even the Roman world, that you wish people would understand today?
I would say that I see this in my classes. I mean, my goal is to really communicate that these texts that have been made sacred, before they were made sacred, they were written by human beings who, in their writing, are going to be representing their cultural positions. And these are old cultural positions that do not understand a thing about the female body being an autonomous body, being equal with a male body. So I think that that is extremely important for people to understand, that the Bible is a collection of writings that was not sacred when they were written. These texts were written by human beings for particular purposes that they had in mind, and they reflect very much patriarchy of antiquity. And at a certain point in Christian history, you get the Catholics pulling together these books into a sacred text, and they're saying this is our authoritative literature. And when you do that, you make sacred, like holy misogyny. You make misogyny holy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I wonder if you might reflect a little bit more about the ways that you see this sacralized misogyny still persisting today. I mean, I know there's a wide variety of Christian traditions.
Right.
Not all of them, necessarily have the same views about sex and gender, but are there ways that this continues?
There are. And I mean, the easiest thing to point to would be ordination. And then women's education within particular Christian denominations. Yeah, so we saw that. I spoke at length about the Catholic Church in the book and how it perceives women's bodies as the kind of the locus of sin. And even though they recognize Galatians that in Christ there's neither male nor female, that doesn't seem to override for them the inequality of the female's body, that she can't represent Christ.
Right. Only men can be the earthly reflection or representation of God, essentially.
So, because Jesus came as a man. I mean, that's what the argument is. And I go into more detail about how that argument is made and why it's made. The other big place that we see this is in the Southern Baptist Convention, which the Southern Baptists used to be, fairly liberal and progressive. And women were ministers there. They went through seminary the same as the men. And in the 70s and then into the 80s, there started to be a kind of a takeover by the conservative faction of the group. And eventually they revoked that. And they based it on a series of passages, which we traditionally think of in 1 Timothy and so forth, where women can't speak, or they're supposed to be subordinate, they can't teach, and so on and so forth.
Interesting. We had a guest, Kristen Kobus-DeMay, who was talking about the persistence of patriarchy within evangelical Christianity. She finished her book with this sense of what was once done may one day be undone, paraphrasing here.
Yeah.
And so it is important to remember these histories of how things have sometimes looked differently and were different even recently.
Right. Because they have a long history, and as I said, they're normal. They're the way we already think. So, like with Roe v. Wade having been overturned, I mean, a lot of that, we're not talking about it, but a lot of it is about the fact that we do not understand the woman's body to be autonomous. Okay. It is still being understood as the property of the male. And if not that, then her womb is the property of other people. And so now we're legislating that.
I want to talk about a specific chapter in your book, which is devoted to the figure of Mary Magdalene, who is recorded in the New Testament as a really prominent and significant woman in Jesus's mission. In fact, a disciple, an apostle in many ways. Can you share with our listeners more about her prominence and how it was gradually marginalized or reinterpreted in the Christian tradition and why this is so significant?
Yeah, so she's a interesting character because the early Christians, by the time they're writing about her, like she's long gone from their what we would call communicative memory, like an eyewitness or something like that. So they have to kind of figure out who she is like we do today by reading texts that they were familiar with and piece it all together. And what we find are different positions on who she was in antiquity. And yeah, so we're really familiar, of course, with her as a prostitute. That's the image that's most familiar to us because it comes down to us through Catholicism, which we think by the time of about the 5th century that had been pretty much decided that Mary Magdalene, the Mary of Bethany, and the sinner woman in the Gospel of Luke were somehow all the same character. Okay. And so she was being used as kind of a cipher for the repentant woman and what Catholic women should be like. They were repentant sinners. She's the first Eve, and, so on and so forth. But other images of her we find in the material. We're also familiar with her as Jesus's wife. There was a group of Christians that we call the Valentinians. They were a Gnostic group who understood God to be both male and female. And so in their system, if you think about it, Jesus comes to earth in their system and he has to have a wife because that's the ideal condition. That's the saved condition in their mythology. And so I think they poked around the text and they saw that, Mary seemed to be hanging out there and there was never a mention of a husband or anything. So they connected her and she becomes Jesus's partner or spouse in their works. And then we have other group of folks that are living off in Syria, the early Christians, who think marriage is a state of sin. So they advocate celibacy and what we call an encratic lifestyle. And so Mary in their text, it turns out to be the strong, powerful male woman. She has to become male, and she's this celibate teacher. And so we can see how groups will take these sort of heroic figures and read texts and create kind of that figure in their image.
Yeah, what they want.
Yeah.
Really. And I thought one of the most interesting things as well that you talk about in that chapter is that from, the earliest kind of recordings, memories of who Mary might have been, there is this real sense of her prominence within, Jesus's ministry, if you want to call it that. And even the gospel writers themselves were both acknowledging it as well as trying to minimize it in a kind of way.
Exactly. Yeah. A good example of that is in the story of the Gospel of John. So at the tomb, you get the tomb story with Mary there. And she appears to be kind of the first one. And then you get this intrusive story, and you can go and look how the story kind of breaks. And suddenly we've got Peter, having this foot race to the tomb, and he gets there and he looks in it first, right? So, okay, this is the only gospel where we have that going on, but it clearly, that story of Peter is interpolated within. If we pull it out, we see the Mary story just is a beautiful story that just continues on in the rest of the chapter. But yeah. So already our gospel writers are trying to say, well, she really isn't the one that was witness to the resurrection.
Yeah. One of the things that I took away from reading your book is that there are these remnants, these sort of, I don't know if we want to call them these dangerous memories or counter memories, but there's these remnants that persist in the text that actually point us back to the fact that there were substantive roles for women. Women played a big influence in the rise and spread of Christianity. And also you point out that we have enough in the text to suggest that the figure of Jesus himself historically was deeply concerned with women's issues.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's the recovery of that material, and I really wanted to be able to bring it really into the public light. It's one of the reasons I wrote this book. I wrote it as a public contribution, but I also wanted to be able to somehow present this to a church congregation. Like, I wanted to get it out there.
I want to finish by just asking you, you have this breadth of experience, wide scholarly experience beyond what we've already been discussing today. And you've done many interviews, you've published many books, you've been on podcasts, you've really been a public voice for bringing attention to the relevance of the study of early Christianity and related traditions. And so what can an understanding, I guess, of biblical literature, early Christianity, what can it do to help situate and clarify conversations in public life that are occurring today?
This is going to sound lame, but religious literacy.
Yeah.
And I say that because, so I get my undergrad students, and they come in, and it's clear that they either haven't had any religious education, and I don't mean that, I mean any education about religion, like they haven't studied anything about religion, or they have some kind of a church setting that they've been involved in and they know something about that. And so when they come into my classes, they start to articulate, wait a minute, I didn't understand, like in antiquity, that the Egyptians had all of this concept of God and gods, and they were like, the Greek philosophers were talking about the primal source of life and who God is, and like they don't understand the sort of connection between religion and culture, and that the beliefs that they have are not some sort of inherent stuff, that they actually develop and they form within historical environments.
Right, absolutely. And actually that is so important. And I'm glad you brought up students, because it reminded me, I taught a course last semester on religion, gender, and inequality. And we talked a lot about women's leadership in the church and about this movement to ordain, it's a sort of a renegade movement, but a movement to ordain women as priests in the Catholic Church.
That's right.
And I personally, not to throw any of our students under the bus, but I was shocked because a good portion of the students reflected shock, not knowing that only men could be priests, and shock that Catholic priest is a male-only guild. And for me, that fact is something that I've always kind of understood to be as part, a main tenet of the tradition. And I was just struck by that, like that they had no conception that has been such a long-standing historical precedent.
Yeah. The religious literacy is really important, because if we as people cannot understand how religions are constructed, I think that we're going to have a hard time being pluralistic and moving beyond just trying to tolerate each other.
Yeah. What a important note to end on. I want to thank you so much, April, for being with us today. I've learned so much through reading your work and also this conversation.
Thank you for taking the time to read the book, and I'm delighted to be able to share my thoughts about it.
Thank you so much. That's it for this episode of Religion Unmuted. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe to, rate, and review us wherever you listen. Follow us on Twitter at RiceRPLP. And thanks to our guest, April DeConick. To Today's show was written by myself and Haley Hemstreet. Our series is produced by Three Wire Creative, Elaine Howard-Eklund, and Pamela Prickett. We had support from the Henry Luce Foundation and the American Academy of Religion. I'm Rachel Schneider. Until next time.